Forest landowners face many challenges and issues in owning forest land. Let's talk about land ownership and embracing land management. Most landowners we know are not adverse to managing their property. Actually, many of them want to manage their property for things such as wildlife habitat, but they are increasingly concerned about protecting amenities and ecological qualities more so than maximizing profits. So often we talk about landowners when it comes to management as cost minimizers. They look for ways to minimize the cost on the things they do. They're not so much worried about timber harvesting and making a profit off of their land. Now, granted, this is not true for all landowners, but in general, we know that most landowners are concerned about protecting those amenities such as wildlife habitat, aesthetics, ecological qualities that come along with land ownership and their property. Now, throughout the southern United States, but specifically here we'll look at an example here from North Carolina, looking at land use change. We know from 1990 to about 2000, North Carolina grew by approximately 1.4 million people. By 2013, we were up to 9.8 million people here in North Carolina. And currently today, we are the 9th most populated state in the nation. And by 2030, we're expected to be the 7th most populated state in the nation. So for many landowners throughout the South, specifically in North Carolina, are faced with the challenges associated with development and land use change that is increasingly putting pressure on their lands, and that's really taking place across our whole state, but we're seeing significant changes currently in the regions of the Piedmont and the coastal plains. So with that comes along the issues and trade-offs of forest management related to social acceptability, and that's becoming more important. So what our neighbors think about what we're doing on our land is driving a lot of what we do from a management standpoint. So for example, you might own 400 acres of forest land here on the edge of Raleigh in North Carolina, and a subdivision goes up next to you. And then when it comes time for you to do management on your property, those people, those neighbors of yours, may not realize what you're doing is to improve the health of your forest, to attract more wildlife and things like that. All they see is that you're cutting timber and think it's bad. So it becomes an issue then, how do you do management and deal with those kind of concerns? Also, we're seeing having to trade off between environmental impacts and land ownership. And we really, in this state, we probably have here in North Carolina the most active non-government organizations which can impact land management. You have groups out there that, for example, that are focused on, currently we have pellet mills in the coastal plains of North Carolina that look to our hardwood and pine forests in those regions to harvest. And our NGOs are concerned about logging wet areas, hardwood areas that are traditionally wet in the eastern part of the state, and push on the forest industry to make sure that they're having no impact on the environment when it comes to forestry. And in a lot of ways, they push hard enough, they're trying to prevent forestry from taking place. And then landowners got to think about the economic viability of land ownership. Can landowners do better with their money than intensive forestry? And that's something they got to think about, because a lot of our forest landowners, even though they're not into forestry for timber production, we do have landowners that turn to their land looking for an economic viability of land ownership and making it economically feasible to hold on to their land. One of the biggest challenges landowners face related to forest management in this state is our natural stands have been degraded through high grading over years and years of time. This gets back to that ecological aspect of land ownership and the trade-offs and everything. We know that past farming practices have resulted in loss of topsoil and loss of site quality, which impacts then the next generation of trees. And because of high grading, poor soils, and loss of site quality, what we see are there's many stands of really in the hardwoods of our states, hardwood stands, that are really in a condition that probably should be clear cut and start over to recapture the quality that's capable of being produced on those sites. But because of our ability, lack of ability to manage in the past, we've degraded those stands. Many of them still have the potential to produce high quality hardwoods, but many of those stands in their current state are low grade hardwoods that just aren't of the quality that they could be. So come along with forest management challenges is the option of trying to get things done. Many landowners look for alternative management options such as horse logging or other small-scale opportunities. The problem with that is there's really limited opportunities for small-scale logging and things. So for our smaller landowners, landowners that own smaller acreage, that is, those that own 5, 10, 15 acres, it's hard for them to get management done because there is no real alternative management options besides the traditional forestry equipment. Also, we see limited markets for traditional forest goods and services. As populations increase, the ability to get management done decreases. Much of the infrastructure in place related to forestry, as population goes up, that infrastructure moves on to places where it's much more easily to practice forestry. And then just the lack of information about forestry and assistance to the landowners also makes it more difficult from a forest management standpoint. When we talk about forest management challenges, a lot of this is being driven by our change in population here in the South. We've seen a significant increase in populations, and this puts pressure on the landowners from adjacent owners. Development is popping up along boundaries of our forests that traditionally you as a neighbor may have owned 40 or 50 acres of forest land, and the next neighbor to you had another 100 acres, and the neighbor next to you had 75 acres, and if you looked at all of it, it was about 225 acres of contiguous forest. Now we see is because of the population increase, which is a higher degree of visibility to a greater population on what we do on the property, problems with trash, fire, non-native invasive plants and animals that might impact our forest. We're also seeing fragmentation and parcelization. And what this means is with fragmentation, we're seeing that our forest is being divided up and chopped up into blocks, and we're getting smaller blocks of forest intermixed among urban development. And then with parcelization, what we see is large tracts of land that are being divided up into smaller parcels. Now, parcelization really is probably driven more by passing that land on to the next generation, where, for example, mom and dad move the land over to the kids, and they have 4 kids, and each child gets a portion of that property, and they parcelize that. In other words, they divide it up, and each one gets, for example, if it's 100 acres and you got 4 kids, each kid gets 25 acres. Well, now you have parcelization taking place on that property, which then impacts the management of that property, because now you got 4 different people trying to make management decisions, and person A may not be in the same mindset as person D. And so they do different management practices on their own parcels versus before where they could manage all 100 acres. With new developments, we're seeing increased pressures on amenities. We're seeing people are looking for more amenities from our public lands. They're looking for places for recreation, walking their dog, bird watching, things like that, which impacts then our ability to manage forest. If, for example, we have a school forest here in Raleigh called the Schenck Forest, and I know because of the increase in pressures from populations around that forest and everything, and the impact that dog walkers had on the forest, we had to ban dogs from the forest because they were destroying stream banks and things like that where they were crossing and everything. So to protect the health of the forest, we had to prevent people from walking their dogs in the forest. Many newcomers are concerned about the management practices that take place on a forest. They're worried about the dangers that are associated with forestry equipment and felling of trees, offensive odors that may come from the land, such as the exhaust from the heavy equipment, logging trucks driving down the roads, and then just it competes with additional housing developments and retail stores, which for many local governments is a economic boom if they're able to convert a portion of rural land, such as a forest land, into a housing development or retail stores because they get higher taxes for it. So what are some of the risks that we experience from forest ownership because of human influences? We know that flooding changes. Our floodplains have changed over time due to development around and as areas become more urbanized and less, much of that water then runs off and into our creeks, and we have extreme floods. We have the level of flooding that takes place, not so much the duration, but the level of that would peak often happens faster and sooner. All of this can impact our forest management downstream. Fires, we know as we become closer to urban areas, we tend to see more fires. People are, just because of the volume of people and everything, the risk of fire increases. Urbanization relates back to parcelization and fragmentation, has a huge impact on our forests. We also see that many of our, because of increased human, even wind is impacted because of the climate and climate change and things like that related to the weather has a huge impact on our forest and forest management capabilities. As I said, there are changes to the ecosystem that are taking place due to fragmentation and parcelization. We're also seeing decreased air and water quality associated with the changes to our ecosystem related to urbanization and the population growth. And then the reduced or degraded wildlife habitat. Because of fragmentation and parcelization, parcels are smaller, which may not fit into what is needed for wildlife habitat for that species. The other thing is increased non-native invasive plants. We see that many of our plants that we plant in and around our homes are not native plants, and in some cases can be very invasive. Other plants that we have introduced to the United States because of things like erosion control, kudzu would be a prime example here in the South, could be very detrimental to forest land management and forestry. Other issues that come along with population change and increase in population is the lack of effective growth management. For many landowners, they face challenges due to urbanization and population increases, and as for many governments, we're not always effective in the management of that growth. Historically, here in the United States, we like to spread out across the landscape, not build in very dense manners. So we see a lot more pressure and parcelization and breaking up of our forest as we all go out to get our own little piece of the pie. And with the problem with land use planning and policy is that there's no common approach to jurisdictional boundaries. and then regulation of forestry practices increase often with urbanization. Here, for example, in North Carolina, I do know we do not have a right to practice forestry law. What what law was passed recently in about the last 10 years related to forestry is that local governments cannot develop ordinances to prevent the practice of forestry. But for many local governments, the way they can control forestry is through zoning. So tree ordinances and things like that are separate policies that might impact forestry, but they can zone forestry out through developing districts, zoning districts, and those zoning districts then can be, they can regulate forestry practices within those zones. So local government still can and do impact the ability to practice forestry through zoning laws. But for many of them, we've also, to counteract that, many of our local governments and stuff, our county governments, have looked to things such as voluntary agricultural districts that promote agriculture and forestry, warns people that are moving into those areas that agriculture and forestry are important practices and operations, that there's smells and odors associated with them that you may come across, and should be aware of that before moving into this area. So in summary, we know that North Carolina is one of the nation's most rapidly urbanizing states. Throughout the Southeast here, we know that urbanization creates unique challenges for landowners, can negatively have impacts on resource management, impacting the amenities of our forests and how they're utilized. Urbanization causes parcelization and fragmentation, which is breaking our forest up into smaller pieces. We're also seeing, because of urbanization, increased pressure on forest amenities, such as use of our forest for recreation. More people using areas for recreation can have detrimental effect on the health of those forests. There are all kinds of risks faced by forest landowners that are influenced by humans, such as fire, weather, wildlife habitat. Those are different things that are impacted by humans. And we know that because of population and urbanization, we're seeing increased potential for neighbors to directly affect one another's quality of life.